If you want to survive a night like that, you must learn how to stop trembling. The words were still echoing in Evelyn Carter's mind as dawn bled pale light through the tall windows of Langley Manor. She stood alone beside a porcelain basin, the water icy against her skin, watching a streak of dark red wax dissolve from her fingertips. It wasn't blood. It was the seal she had broken only hours ago, proof that she had read the document meant to bind her forever. 19 years old, and already she understood what it meant to be traded. The wedding had been held beneath a vaulted ceiling 30 feet high, crystal chandeliers burning brighter than the winter sun outside. Guests had smiled as if attending a celebration, though everyone knew it was a transaction. Lord Horace Langley, 82 and stooped beneath the weight of his own legacy, had taken her hand with ceremonial care. He had not looked at her as a bride. He had looked at her as an answer. Her family's debts, nearly $200,000, would vanish by morning. In exchange, Evelyn would become Lady Langley. In exchange, she would sign where she was told. The manor itself felt less like a home and more like a monument. 10-foot oak doors, marble floors that held the night's chill, portraits of ancestors staring down from gilt frames as if judging the new addition to their bloodline. After the reception faded and the guests departed, she had been escorted down a corridor lined with gas lamps flickering against dark velvet wallpaper. No cruelty, no raised voices, just expectation. A door closing softly behind her, a pen placed in her hand. She had signed the marriage register first, then another document, and another, each page thick as parchment, each line written in careful legal language that locked estates, funds, and inheritances into place. That was when she understood. Lord Langley did not need companionship. He needed a lawful wife before sunrise. Someone young, someone unquestioning, someone whose name would seal what his own could not. But Evelyn had not been entirely unquestioning. While he spoke of legacy and stability, her gaze had drifted to a second folder left half open on his desk. A will revised only days earlier. A clause transferring millions if his marital status changed before the week ended. Her signature had triggered it. Her presence had secured it. And somewhere beyond those walls, someone else was waiting for that transfer to clear. The realization had settled into her bones like frost. She was not merely a bride. She was a key, a lock, a deadline. As the first light of morning stretched across the marble floor, a distant sound broke the silence. A carriage arriving through 12 inches of fresh snow. The engine's low rumble cut through the stillness of Langley Manor. Evelyn lifted her head slowly. She did not yet know the name Nathaniel Pierce. She did not know he had been summoned because of a financial irregularity flagged at 3 in the morning. She did not know that by noon, the carefully arranged future plan for her would begin to fracture. But she felt it. The shift in the air. The way the house itself seemed to hold its breath. And for the first time since the ceremony, Evelyn Carter stopped trembling. By 7 in the morning, the entire manor knew a visitor had arrived. Servants moved more quickly, their polished shoes whispering across marble floors, their voices lowered to careful murmurs. Evelyn stood near the tall parlor windows, watching the last of the snow swirl across the gravel drive as a dark sedan idled beneath the portico. The engine shut off. A door opened. A man stepped out with the unhurried precision of someone accustomed to entering rooms already prepared for him. Nathaniel Pierce did not rush. He did not glance upward at the towering facade of Langley Manor as though impressed. His gaze was steady, analytical, taking in the frost clinging to the columns, the recently cleared pathway, the faint glow still burning in the east wing windows. Inside, Lord Horace had not yet risen from his private study. Or perhaps he had not slept at all. The night had been long, filled with documents and deliberate signatures. Evelyn remembered the way his voice had softened when he spoke of security, of ensuring stability before the year's end. Stability for whom? She wondered now. She folded her hands in front of her, posture straight, chin lifted. If she was to survive in this house, she would not do so as a frightened girl. She would do so as Lady Langley. The front doors opened with a quiet echo. Nathaniel entered without removing his gloves immediately, snow melting in small droplets along the shoulders of his dark overcoat. He was younger than she expected. Mid-30s, perhaps. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a calm expression that did not betray warmth or hostility. His eyes swept the foyer once, briefly resting on the black-draped portrait above the staircase before shifting to the butler who approached him with a respectful nod. There was no theatrical greeting, no exchange of pleasantries. Only a request delivered in a low, controlled voice. He wished to review the revised trust documents executed overnight. The air seemed to tighten at the word revised. Evelyn felt it like a thread pulled taut between rooms. She should not have understood the significance, yet she did. The will she had glimpsed. The clause triggered by her marriage. The urgency that had pressed the pen into her hand. From across the foyer, Nathaniel's gaze shifted again, this time settling on her. Not with curiosity, with calculation. He did not smile. He did not bow. But he noticed. She could see it in the faint narrowing of his eyes, in the way his attention lingered a second longer than politeness required. He saw the ink still faintly staining her thumb despite her attempts to wash it away. He saw the tension in her shoulders that did not match the composure of a celebrated bride. For a brief moment, neither of them looked away. Then the sound of a study door opening upstairs broke the silence. A cane tapped once against hardwood flooring. Lord Horace's voice carried faintly down the staircase, formal and measured. "Mr. Pierce, I trust you had a safe drive." Safe. The word felt ironic. Because somewhere beneath the polished surfaces and inherited wealth, something had shifted during the night. A transfer had been initiated, a safeguard activated, and Evelyn understood, with growing clarity, that Nathaniel Pierce had not driven through 12 inches of snow simply to offer congratulations. He had come because something did not align. Something had moved too quickly, and she, standing at the center of it, was no longer merely a bride in a quiet mansion. She was a variable in a calculation that someone had misjudged. The study doors closed with a measured click, sealing Nathaniel Pierce and Lord Horace Langley inside a room that smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. Evelyn remained in the foyer for exactly 3 breaths before turning away. She did not wish to appear curious. Curiosity, she was beginning to understand, could be dangerous in a house where documents moved faster than conversations. She walked toward the east corridor, her steps steady despite the quiet tremor beneath her ribs. Through tall arched windows, the snow reflected a pale silver light that made the marble floors glow like ice. Somewhere upstairs, a clock chimed 8 times. 8 hours since she had signed her name. 8 hours since her life had shifted from uncertain to controlled. Yet control, she realized, was never absolute. Not in a house built on clauses and contingencies. Inside the study, Lord Horace's voice carried faintly through the thick door. Calm, confident. He spoke of precaution, of timing, of ensuring that the transfer occurred before the close of business today. Nathaniel responded less often, but when he did, his tone was precise. The amendment was filed at 2:27 a.m., he said at one point, his words clear even through oak and plaster. That is unusually late for an estate revision of this scale. Unusually late. The phrase lingered in Evelyn's mind. She paused near a narrow table where a silver tray still held last night's untouched champagne glasses. One remained half full, the bubbles long faded. She studied her reflection in the glass. Her eyes looked older than they had yesterday. Not hardened, not broken, simply aware. Footsteps approached from the staircase. A woman descended slowly, her posture rigid, her pearl necklace resting perfectly against a navy silk blouse. Lady Margaret Vale, the distant cousin who had overseen wedding arrangements with relentless efficiency. Her smile was polite, but her gaze was sharp. "You should not linger alone," she said softly, stopping 2 steps above Evelyn. "The household is unsettled this morning." "I am simply admiring the snow," Evelyn replied evenly. Lady Margaret's eyes flicked toward the study door, then back. "The snow will melt," she said. "What matters is what remains afterward." The statement felt less like small talk and more like a warning. Before Evelyn could respond, the study door opened. Nathaniel stepped out first, removing his gloves at last. His expression remained controlled, but something had shifted. A subtle tension along his jaw. Lord Horace followed, leaning more heavily on his cane than before. "Everything is in order," he declared, though his voice carried a faint edge. Mr. Pierce merely wished clarification. Nathaniel's gaze moved across the foyer and settled briefly on Evelyn again, not calculating this time, assessing, as if measuring whether she understood the gravity of what had transpired overnight. He crossed the space with unhurried steps. When he stopped before her, the air felt thinner. "Mrs. Langley," he said formally, inclining his head slightly. "Congratulations on your marriage." The words were appropriate, expected, yet beneath them lay something unspoken. A question, a doubt. Evelyn met his eyes without flinching. "Thank you," she replied, her voice calm. For a moment, neither spoke further. Then Nathaniel added quietly, "If you require anything during this transition, the estate office remains available." Transition. Not honeymoon. Not celebration. Transition. The word confirmed what she had already sensed. This marriage had been executed like a transaction nearing its deadline. And deadlines, she knew now, often concealed consequences. As Nathaniel turned toward the door once more, the winter light caught the faint ink still shadowing her thumb. His gaze noticed it again. And this time, he did not look away quickly. The front doors closed behind Nathaniel Pierce with a low, resonant thud that echoed longer than it should have. The sound lingered in the foyer like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence no one had finished. Evelyn remained standing where he had left her, aware that the house felt different now. Not quieter, tighter, as though invisible threads had been drawn between every room. Lord Horace turned without looking at her and made his slow way back toward the study, his cane tapping once for every measured step. "You may retire for the morning," he said over his shoulder. "There is nothing further required of you." Required. The word followed her up the grand staircase, past the veiled portrait, and along the corridor lined with tall windows rimmed in frost. Her new chambers were vast, nearly 20 feet from wall to wall, furnished in pale silk and carved walnut. A fire burned low in the hearth, yet the air still carried the chill of winter pressing against the glass. Evelyn closed the door softly behind her and crossed to the writing desk near the window. The ink bottle there remained unopened. Fresh. Waiting. She did not sit. Instead, she stared out across the snow-covered lawn stretching nearly half a mile to the iron gates at the far end of the drive. Somewhere beyond those gates, Nathaniel Pierce would already be reviewing numbers, timestamps, signatures. He would notice patterns. He had the eyes of someone who saw discrepancies the way others saw colors. And she had given him one without intending to. The faint smear of ink on her thumb. A small detail. But small details mattered in a house built on paper. A knock came, light but deliberate. Lady Margaret entered without waiting for permission. Her heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor as she surveyed the room. "You handled yourself well," she said, her tone almost approving. "Mr. Pierce can be thorough." Evelyn met her gaze evenly. "Is thorough a flaw?" A faint smile curved Lady Margaret's lips. "Only when it delays what has already been decided." She moved closer to the desk, glancing at the untouched stationery. "You understand your role now, do you not? The marriage ensures continuity, stability. Without you, certain matters would have remained complicated." The truth lay beneath her words like ice beneath snow. Evelyn had not been chosen for affection. She had been selected for timing, for legality, for youth that implied years of unquestioned compliance. "And if complications persist?" Evelyn asked quietly. Lady Margaret's eyes sharpened. "They will not." The confidence in her voice was precise, almost rehearsed. Downstairs, a door closed again. Not the heavy front doors this time, but the smaller side entrance leading to the estate offices. Evelyn felt it in her chest before she heard it. Nathaniel had not left. He had merely relocated. The realization spread through her slowly, steady as the fire warming the room. He was still here, still reviewing, still asking questions that no one wanted asked. Lady Margaret turned toward the window, following Evelyn's line of sight toward the distant drive. "You would be wise," she said softly, "to focus on your new title rather than on visitors." When she left, the room felt colder despite the flames. Evelyn moved at last, pulling open the top drawer of the desk. Inside lay a folded copy of the amendment she had signed. Her name stood clear at the bottom in steady ink. But above it, one clause had been adjusted before she placed pen to paper. A single phrase altered from immediate transfer to conditional review. Subtle, nearly invisible, yet enough to slow a transaction that someone had expected to finalize before sunrise. She closed the drawer gently. If Nathaniel Pierce was as thorough as they claimed, he would see it. And when he did, the carefully arranged future built overnight would begin to unravel one quiet thread at a time. By noon, the snow had stopped falling, but the sky remained the color of cold steel. Langley Manor seemed suspended between breath and silence, as if the walls themselves were listening. Evelyn had not left her chambers since Lady Margaret's departure. She stood once more at the window, watching a pair of estate workers shovel a path toward the smaller office wing nearly 300 yards from the main house. Nathaniel Pierce had chosen not to return to the city. That decision alone told her more than any polite congratulation could. He had found something, or he was close to it. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. This time it was not Lady Margaret. A young footman stood at the door, posture stiff with nerves. "Mr. Pierce requests a brief word, Mrs. Langley," he said carefully. "Not summons. Requests." The distinction settled heavily in her chest. She descended the staircase with measured steps, aware of every portrait, every polished railing, every eye that followed her movement. In the small conference room off the side corridor, Nathaniel stood beside a narrow table strewn with documents. The room was modest compared to the grandeur upstairs. 10 feet wide, 15 feet long, one tall window facing the snow. He did not immediately look at her when she entered. Instead, he adjusted a page beneath the light. "Thank you for coming," he said at last. His voice was even, but there was no idle courtesy in it. Only focus. Evelyn closed the door behind her. "You asked to see me." He lifted a single document between his fingers. "You signed this at 2:34 a.m. It was not a question." She nodded once. "Yes." His gaze met hers, steady and searching. "And you read it." A pause. The faintest breath between them. "I read what I was given." That was true. It simply was not the entire truth. Nathaniel stepped closer, reducing the space between them to a careful distance that remained respectful but deliberate. Most individuals in your position do not request amendments before signing. The word amendments felt sharp, almost luminous in the quiet room. Evelyn did not lower her eyes. "Was it improper to request clarity?" she asked softly. For the first time, something flickered in his expression. Not suspicion, recognition. "Clarity," he repeated, "is rarely welcomed when it delays a transfer of $12 million. The number landed with quiet weight. 12 million. She had not known the exact figure, only that it was substantial. Nathaniel placed the document back on the table. "The revision you insisted upon converts immediate disbursement to conditional review, pending a 48-hour confirmation period." His voice lowered slightly. That clause was not part of the original draft. Evelyn felt her heartbeat steady rather than race. Then perhaps the original draft required improvement. Silence expanded between them, but it was no longer suffocating. It was measured, evaluated. Outside the window, a thin shaft of sunlight broke briefly through the clouds, glinting against the snow like a blade of light. Nathaniel's eyes softened by a fraction. "You understand," he said quietly, "that someone expected those funds to clear before today ends." She held his gaze. "And you understand," she replied, "that I was expected to sign without question." For a long moment, neither moved. Then Nathaniel inclined his head slightly, not in deference, but in acknowledgement. "You have complicated matters," he said. "Good," Evelyn answered before she could stop herself. A faint breath left him that might have been the beginning of a restrained smile. "Complications," he said, gathering the papers once more, "tend to reveal truth." And as he walked toward the door, Evelyn realized something had shifted again. She was no longer merely a variable in someone else's calculation. She had become the reason the equation would not balance. The 48-hour review period had begun, and with it, the quiet unraveling of certainty inside Langley Manor. By late afternoon, the sky had cleared enough for pale sunlight to stretch across the frozen lawn, turning the snow into a field of blinding white. Inside, however, the air felt heavier than ever. Evelyn remained in the conference room long after Nathaniel had left, her fingertips resting lightly against the edge of the table where the amended document still lay. She could feel the shift in power like a subtle current beneath the surface of calm conversation. Someone had expected the funds to move swiftly, cleanly, invisibly. Now there was delay, and delay invited scrutiny. Down the corridor, raised voices carried faintly from the study. Not loud, not reckless, controlled tension. Lord Horace rarely allowed emotion to surface, yet the cadence of his speech had sharpened. The clause was unnecessary, he was saying. The transaction was structured with precision. Nathaniel's response came quieter, but firm. Precision does not eliminate oversight. Oversight. The word seemed to echo through the house. Evelyn stepped into the hallway just as Lady Margaret emerged from the study, her expression composed but tight around the edges. Their eyes met, and in that instant, the cordial veneer thinned. "You should not involve yourself in matters beyond your understanding," Lady Margaret said smoothly. Evelyn held her ground. "I sign my name. That qualifies as involvement." A flicker of irritation crossed the older woman's face before it vanished. "You signed because it was necessary," she replied. "Do not confuse necessity with influence." She moved past without another word, her heels striking the marble with controlled force. From the far end of the corridor, Nathaniel appeared again, sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms, jacket removed. The image was subtle but striking, less distant now, more engaged. He paused when he saw Evelyn standing there. "You are being advised to remain uninvolved," he observed quietly. "I gathered as much." He studied her for a moment, as though weighing something internal. "The original draft scheduled disbursement to 3 separate accounts," he said. "2 are legitimate charitable foundations under Mr. Langley's control. The third is less transparent." Evelyn's pulse quickened, though her posture remained steady. "And the 48-hour confirmation?" she asked. "Forces documentation," Nathaniel replied. "Identification. Proof of authorization." He lowered his voice slightly. Whoever anticipated immediate clearance did not anticipate delay. A silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but charged with awareness. "You could have signed without reading," he added. "Most would have." She met his gaze. "Most are not required to live inside the consequences." Something shifted again in his expression. Not merely respect. Alignment. The winter light filtering through the tall windows cast faint shadows across the floor between them. Outside, estate workers cleared another path, their shovels scraping rhythmically against packed snow. Inside, another path was being carved just as deliberately. "The confirmation period expires at 2:34 tomorrow morning," Nathaniel said. "Until then, the transfer remains suspended." Evelyn nodded slowly. "Then we have less than 24 hours. He inclined his head once. Yes. For the first time since dawn, she felt something other than caution. Not fear. Not defiance. Purpose. She had entered Langley Manor as a signature. She was becoming something far less predictable. And as Nathaniel turned back toward the study, documents in hand, Evelyn understood that the next day would determine far more than a financial transfer. It would determine who had orchestrated the urgency behind her marriage, and whether the delay she created would expose a truth no one expected her to see. By evening, Langley Manor no longer felt like a residence. It felt like a vault waiting to be opened. The sun had set early behind a band of iron-gray clouds, and the temperature outside had dropped below 20 degrees. Frost crept along the lower edges of the tall windows, turning the glass opaque in delicate white patterns. Inside the study, lamplight cast long shadows across stacks of financial ledgers. Nathaniel Pierce had not left the room for nearly 3 hours. Evelyn knew because each time she passed the corridor, she could see the thin strip of golden light beneath the door. The house staff moved quietly, unsettled by tension they did not understand but clearly sensed. Shortly after 7 o'clock, the quiet fractured. A call came through to the estate office line, routed first to the butler, then redirected upstairs. Within minutes, raised voices resumed behind the closed study door. Not shouting. Controlled urgency. Evelyn stood near the base of the staircase when Lady Margaret descended swiftly, her expression stripped of its usual composure. "There has been a verification request filed with the bank," she said sharply to no one in particular, though her gaze locked onto Evelyn. "An external compliance inquiry." The words landed like a weight. Evelyn felt the significance immediately. Compliance meant documentation. Documentation meant scrutiny. And scrutiny meant exposure. Nathaniel emerged from the study moments later, phone still in his hand. "The third account requires beneficiary identification," he said evenly. It was flagged due to the conditional review clause. Lord Horace followed behind him, leaning heavily on his cane. "This is unnecessary," he insisted. "The transfer was authorized." "Authorization is not the same as transparency," Nathaniel replied calmly. "The bank requires confirmation of the individual listed under Meridian Holdings." Meridian Holdings. The name had not appeared on the visible drafts. Evelyn saw it in Lady Margaret's eyes before anyone spoke further. A flicker. Recognition. Lord Horace's jaw tightened. That entity is private, he said. As are many entities, Nathaniel answered. However, $12 million does not move without trace. Silence descended over the foyer, thick and charged. The clock above the staircase ticked once. Twice. Evelyn felt every second stretch. The confirmation period expires at 2:34 in the morning, Nathaniel continued. If beneficiary identification is not provided before then, the transfer will be permanently suspended pending investigation. Investigation. The word hung in the air like frost. Lady Margaret stepped forward. You are overstepping, she said, her voice low but sharp. On the contrary, Nathaniel replied. I am preventing exposure. His gaze shifted briefly toward Evelyn. Not accusing, not protective, acknowledging. Because without her amendment, the funds would have cleared before sunrise. Without her delay, Meridian Holdings would have remained invisible. Lord Horace turned away, retreating toward the study once more. Prepare the documentation, he said curtly. But there was strain beneath the command now. For the first time since her arrival, Evelyn sensed imbalance in the foundation of the house itself. The carefully arranged transaction had been designed to close swiftly, quietly, irrevocably. Now it was stalled under fluorescent bank lights and regulatory review. Nathaniel slipped the phone into his coat pocket. We have 7 hours, he said quietly. Either Meridian Holdings is legitimate, or someone has been moving money through a shadow. Evelyn's pulse steadied instead of racing. The snow outside reflected the moonlight now, casting the manor in pale silver. She had entered this house as a signature on a page. Tonight, she had become the reason the page would not turn without scrutiny. And somewhere within those 7 remaining hours, the truth behind Meridian Holdings would surface, whether the house was prepared for it or not. By 11:30 that night, Langley Manor felt suspended in a fragile stillness, as though even the walls understood the weight of the approaching deadline. The temperature outside had fallen to 15 degrees, and the moonlight turned the snow into a sheet of pale glass stretching nearly half a mile to the estate gates. Inside the study, only one lamp remained lit. Nathaniel stood near the desk, jacket back on, sleeves crisp, documents spread before him with deliberate precision. Evelyn had not returned to her chambers. Instead, she stood near the fireplace across from him, the flames low but steady, casting a faint amber glow against the dark wood paneling. Lord Horace had retreated earlier, citing fatigue, though the tension in his departure suggested something else. Lady Margaret, however, had not withdrawn. She remained seated in the corner, posture immaculate, hands folded in her lap, as if attending a formal meeting rather than the unraveling of a carefully constructed plan. The bank requires beneficiary identification, Nathaniel repeated calmly. Meridian Holdings lists a single controlling authority. That authority must present verification before 2:34 a.m. Lady Margaret's gaze did not waver. The documentation is being prepared, she replied smoothly. Certain assets require discretion. Nathaniel did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Discretion is not exemption, he said. The registration records show Meridian Holdings was established 48 hours ago. The words landed like a crack in ice. Evelyn felt the impact in her chest. 48 hours. The same window as her marriage. The same window as the amended will. Lady Margaret's composure flickered, just slightly. Corporate entities are formed frequently for estate planning purposes, she said. Timing does not imply misconduct. Nathaniel slid a single sheet across the desk toward the center of the room. This entity lists a provisional beneficiary designation, he said quietly. That designation was amended at 2:29 a.m., 5 minutes before Mrs. Langley signed the marriage register. Silence expanded, thick and unmistakable. Evelyn's breath slowed instead of quickened. 5 minutes. Someone had adjusted the beneficiary before her signature locked the clause into effect. Someone had anticipated compliance. Who was listed? She asked softly. Nathaniel's eyes shifted to her, then back to the document. The beneficiary is a private trust under the oversight of Lady Margaret Vale. The fire crackled once, sharp in the stillness. Lady Margaret rose smoothly to her feet. This is a precautionary structure, she said, her voice calm but firm. Lord Horace authorized it to protect his legacy from external interference. External interference, Nathaniel repeated. Or internal control. The clock on the mantel ticked, its hands inching closer to midnight. Evelyn stepped forward at last, her voice steady. If Meridian Holdings exists to protect the estate, then transparency should not threaten it. Lady Margaret's gaze turned colder. You misunderstand the complexity of inherited wealth. No, Evelyn replied quietly. I understand timing. Nathaniel gathered the papers once more. The bank will not release funds without verified disclosure, he said, and any attempt to bypass that process will trigger a formal investigation. The word hung between them, undeniable now. Outside, the wind brushed against the windows, soft but persistent. Inside, the carefully arranged transfer stood exposed under scrutiny. There were just over 3 hours left. 3 hours before confirmation expired. 3 hours before Meridian Holdings would either stand as legitimate or collapse under its own construction. Evelyn met Nathaniel's gaze across the room. In that silent exchange, something solidified. She had delayed a transaction. Now she was witnessing its truth. And as midnight struck, Langley Manor was no longer a monument to inheritance. It was a house waiting for revelation. At 1:47 in the morning, the manor no longer tried to pretend it was calm. The silence had sharpened into something brittle, like glass under pressure. The grandfather clock in the foyer marked each passing minute with deliberate precision. 2:44 would arrive whether anyone was ready or not. Nathaniel stood at the long table in the study, a single desk lamp illuminating the documents before him. His phone lay face up beside the papers, screen dark but waiting. Evelyn remained near the window, her reflection faint against the blackened glass. Outside, the snow no longer shimmered. It absorbed the moonlight now, dull and watchful. Lady Margaret had not left the room. She stood with her back straight, hands clasped lightly, her composure intact but strained at the edges. The verification documents are en route, she said for the third time. The trustee will confirm Meridian Holdings before the deadline. Nathaniel did not look up. The trustee is required to confirm ownership in person or through notarized identification, he replied evenly. The bank will not accept verbal assurances. 1:58. The clock continued its steady rhythm. Lord Horace entered quietly, his cane striking the floor with less certainty than before. He did not sit. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he looked at Evelyn. Really looked at her. For the first time since the ceremony. You have caused unnecessary delay, he said at last, his voice thinner than it had been that morning. Evelyn did not lower her gaze. Delay invites clarity, she answered softly. 2:06. Nathaniel's phone vibrated once against the wood. All eyes shifted toward it. He picked it up, read the message, and exhaled slowly. The bank has received partial documentation, he said. However, the identification does not match the provisional amendment timestamp. Lady Margaret stepped forward sharply. That is impossible. Nathaniel turned the screen slightly, so she could see. Meridian Holdings was amended at 2:29 a.m. yesterday. The submitted trustee documents were notarized at 3:15 a.m. A pause. 46 minutes too late. The fire in the hearth cracked softly. Evelyn felt the weight of the room shift again, not violently, but definitively. What does that mean? Lord Horace asked, his voice measured but unsteady. Nathaniel's gaze remained calm. It means the beneficiary revision occurred before the trust documentation was legally established. Silence fell, heavy and unmistakable. 2:23. Lady Margaret's composure thinned visibly now. The timing discrepancy is administrative, she insisted. The intent remains valid. Intent is not law, Nathaniel replied. And $12 million does not move on intent. 2:28. The clock seemed louder now. Evelyn felt her pulse align with its rhythm. She had signed at 2:34. That moment had been chosen deliberately, planned. Yet 5 minutes before her signature, someone had shifted the beneficiary. Too quickly, too carelessly. 2:33. Nathaniel's phone lit again. He read the notification, then looked up. The bank has suspended Meridian Holdings pending formal investigation, he said quietly. The transfer is void. The word landed like a door closing. Void. 2:34. The clock struck once. The confirmation window expired. Lady Margaret's hands fell slowly to her sides. Lord Horace lowered himself into the nearest chair without speaking. The house did not collapse. The walls did not shake. But something invisible had fractured beyond repair. Evelyn remained standing where she was, her breathing steady. She had entered this manor as an instrument of timing. Tonight, timing had turned. Nathaniel met her eyes across the room, not triumphant, not surprised. Certain, the transfer had failed. The truth had surfaced, and Langley Manor would never again operate in silence. The clock had finished striking 2:34, yet no one moved. The silence that followed was not relief. It was recalculation. Nathaniel lowered his phone onto the desk with deliberate care, as if even that small sound might fracture what remained of the room's control. The fire in the hearth had burned low, embers glowing a muted orange against blackened wood. Outside, the snow lay undisturbed beneath a pale winter moon. Inside, the transfer was void, and with it, the certainty that had driven the last 24 hours. Lord Horace remained seated, his cane resting across his knees, fingers curled around its handle. The authority he had carried all day seemed to have thinned, replaced by something closer to fatigue. "This can be remedied," he said finally, though the conviction in his voice no longer matched the words. Nathaniel did not contradict him. He did not agree either. "An investigation will follow," he said calmly. "Meridian holdings will be examined. The amendment timeline will be reviewed. All associated signatures will be scrutinized." The word signatures lingered. Evelyn felt it settle against her like a final confirmation of what she had altered. Lady Margaret stood rigid near the mantel, her composure no longer polished but strained. "You have forced unnecessary exposure," she said to Evelyn, her voice low and tight. "Exposure was already present," Evelyn replied quietly. "I only slowed it." For a moment, Lady Margaret seemed ready to respond, but no words came. There was no immediate counterargument for facts now recorded in bank systems and compliance logs. Nathaniel gathered the documents into a neat stack, aligning their edges with precise movements. "The estate remains intact," he said. "No funds have moved. No accounts have cleared. What changes now is oversight." Oversight, the very thing someone had tried to outrun. Lord Horace exhaled slowly, leaning back into the chair. "And my marriage?" he asked, the question directed not to Evelyn, but to the room itself. The air shifted. The fire cracked softly again. Nathaniel answered without hesitation. "Your marriage stands. However, any financial instrument tied directly to its timing will remain frozen until review concludes." In other words, the urgency that had propelled the ceremony had dissolved. Evelyn felt the truth of that settle deep within her chest. She had not been chosen for companionship. She had been chosen for timing. And now timing had failed. Lady Margaret moved toward the door, her heels sharp against the hardwood floor. "This is not finished," she said quietly before exiting the study. The words were not a threat. They were a promise of complexity ahead. When the door closed behind her, the room felt different. Lighter, though not free. Nathaniel turned toward Evelyn at last, his expression measured but unmistakably steady. "You understood the risk," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she answered. He studied her for a long moment, as if recalibrating his assessment of who she was. "Most would have signed without reading," he said again. "Most were not asked to surrender their future overnight," she replied. Something almost imperceptible softened in his gaze. Respect, perhaps, or recognition. Lord Horace rose slowly from his chair, leaning on his cane. "We will speak tomorrow," he said to Evelyn, though the command lacked force. She inclined her head once, neither submissive nor defiant, simply composed. As he left the study, the embers in the fireplace dimmed further. The crisis of the transfer had ended, but the structure that created it had cracked. Nathaniel moved toward the window, looking out across the frozen lawn stretching into darkness. "You changed the equation," he said quietly, not turning around. Evelyn stepped beside him, the cold glass inches from her fingertips. "No," she answered just as softly. "I refuse to be part of it." Outside, the snow remained untouched. Inside, Langley Manor had shifted in ways no document could fully record. The transfer was void, the investigation inevitable, and for the first time since the ceremony, Evelyn felt something unfamiliar rise beneath the weight of the house. Not fear, not obligation. Choice. Morning did not arrive gently. It came pale and uninvited through frost-rimmed windows, exposing the fatigue etched into every corner of Langley Manor. By 8 o'clock, the house had resumed its routines, but the rhythm felt altered. Servants moved with careful quiet. Doors closed more softly. Conversations stopped when footsteps approached. Oversight had begun its silent work. Evelyn stood alone in the east corridor, sunlight stretching nearly 20 feet across the marble floor. The events of the night replayed in her mind with unsettling clarity. The voided transfer, the investigation, the fracture in certainty. She had expected anger, accusation. Instead, what lingered was something more dangerous. Awareness. A study door opened behind her. Lord Horace stepped into the hall, dressed immaculately despite the visible weight in his posture. His gaze settled on her, not sharp, not warm, measured. "Walk with me," he said quietly. They moved slowly toward the long gallery overlooking the southern lawn, nearly 300 yards of snow-dusted field stretching toward the iron gates. The winter air beyond the glass looked brittle. "You have disrupted arrangements," he began, his tone calm but stripped of pretense. "Arrangements designed to protect this estate." Evelyn did not interrupt. "Protection that relies on concealment," she replied after a moment, "is not protection. It is postponement." He stopped walking. For a fraction of a second, something like surprise crossed his face. Not at her defiance. At her articulation. "You speak as though you anticipated this outcome," he said. "I anticipated urgency," she answered. "And urgency rarely favors fairness." Silence settled between them. In the distance, a car approached the gates, its tires carving faint tracks into fresh snow. Nathaniel Pierce had not left the property. He had relocated to the estate office wing before sunrise. Oversight did not rest. "The investigation will examine all parties," Lord Horace continued, "including you." The statement carried no threat, only fact. "Then I will answer," Evelyn said evenly. He studied her for a long moment, as though re-evaluating the girl he had married less than 48 hours ago. "You were not selected for resistance," he said finally. "I was not consulted," she replied. A faint exhale left him, almost a reluctant acknowledgement. They resumed walking. Downstairs, the faint murmur of voices indicated that documentation was already being prepared for compliance officers. Meridian Holdings would not vanish quietly. It would be dissected, timelines reconstructed, signatures compared. Evelyn paused near the end of the gallery, sunlight illuminating the ink-stained shadow still faintly visible on her thumb. A mark left by choice. Footsteps approached from behind. Nathaniel's presence was unmistakable even before he spoke. "The bank has escalated the review to regulatory oversight," he said calmly. "Formal inquiry begins today." Lord Horace nodded once, the acceptance in the gesture heavier than defeat. "Then it begins," he said. Nathaniel's gaze shifted briefly to Evelyn, not with approval or blame, but with recognition. "It begins because the timeline did not hold," he said quietly. Evelyn met his eyes without hesitation. Then perhaps the timeline was flawed. The winter light brightened momentarily as clouds parted overhead. For the first time since she had stepped into Langley Manor, the future did not feel predetermined. It felt uncertain, exposed, and within that exposure, possibility lingered. The estate would endure scrutiny. Reputations would adjust. Structures would either stand under examination or collapse. But Evelyn no longer felt like an instrument inside someone else's design. She felt like the variable that refused to disappear. By early afternoon, the estate no longer belonged to silence. Two black sedans rolled through the iron gates just after 1:15, their tires carving deliberate lines through the snow. The vehicles stopped beneath the portico, engines idling briefly before shutting down in unison. From the East Gallery, Evelyn watched as three individuals stepped out, dressed in tailored coats, leather briefcases in hand. Regulatory oversight had arrived in person. Inside, Langley Manor adjusted instantly. Staff straightened. Doors opened without delay. Formal greetings were exchanged in tones polished by generations of inherited authority. Yet beneath that refinement, tension moved like an undercurrent. Nathaniel stood at the entrance hall as the visitors were escorted inside. His posture was composed, neither defensive nor accommodating beyond necessity. "We appreciate your cooperation," one of the officials said, voice calm but precise. "We will require access to all relevant trust amendments and timestamped correspondence." Lord Horace nodded, dignity intact though visibly diminished by the weight of scrutiny. "You will have what you need," he replied. Lady Margaret remained several steps behind, her expression composed but guarded, as though calculating each movement of the unfolding review. Evelyn descended the staircase slowly, aware that her presence would not go unnoticed. She was, after all, the signature that had shifted the timeline. One of the officials glanced toward her. "Mrs. Langley," he acknowledged politely. "We may request a brief statement regarding the amendment clause." Her pulse remained steady. "I will provide it," she answered. In the study, files were arranged across the long oak table. Meridian Holdings documentation lay separated, flagged with notes and timestamp comparisons. The officials worked methodically, examining not only the trust registration but the formation papers filed 48 hours prior. The entity's establishment preceded beneficiary revision by less than 6 hours, one investigator observed quietly. "That proximity is irregular." Lady Margaret spoke then, her tone measured. "Estate planning often requires swift adaptation." Nathaniel did not interrupt, but his gaze remained fixed on the documents. "Swift," he said evenly, "is not synonymous with sound." The review stretched across nearly 3 hours. Pages were photographed, digital records cross-referenced, bank confirmations verified. At last, one of the officials closed his briefcase with deliberate finality. "Preliminary findings indicate that Meridian Holdings lacks sufficient foundational disclosure," he stated. "The beneficiary amendment tied to the marriage will be deemed invalid pending further investigation." Invalid. The word did not echo. It settled. Lady Margaret's shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly. Lord Horace exhaled slowly, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement of inevitability. The structure had been examined. It had not withstood inspection. As the officials prepared to depart, one paused beside Evelyn. "Your amendment request delayed a significant irregularity," he said quietly. "That delay prevented automatic disbursement." She inclined her head once, accepting. Neither praise nor blame. When the sedans pulled away at 4:22 in the afternoon, Langley Manor felt altered once more. Not shattered. Exposed. The air inside the study seemed clearer, as though a veil had been lifted. Nathaniel gathered the remaining documents into a single stack. "The investigation will continue," he said calmly. "But the transfer cannot proceed under its original structure." Evelyn stepped toward the window, watching the tracks left by departing vehicles fade beneath drifting snow. "Then the structure was never stable," she replied softly. Nathaniel's gaze rested on her, steady and unguarded now. "No," he said. "It was built on urgency." Outside, the winter sky began to soften toward evening. Inside, the estate no longer operated in concealment. The entity had been invalidated, the timeline dismantled, and for the first time since her arrival, Evelyn felt the house stand not on timing, but on truth revealed under light. The snow began to fall again just before dusk, softer this time, drifting down in slow, deliberate spirals as though the sky itself had decided to quiet the estate. Langley Manor stood unchanged in structure, yet entirely altered in spirit. The investigation had not concluded, but its direction was clear. Meridian Holdings would not be revived. The hurried amendment tied to Evelyn's marriage would remain void. And urgency, once the driving force behind every decision, had dissolved under examination. In the long gallery, nearly 30 feet of glass reflected the fading light. Evelyn stood alone at first, her fingers lightly tracing the cool edge of the window pane. 48 hours earlier, she had entered this house as an answer to someone else's calculation. Now she understood she had become the interruption that forced clarity. Footsteps approached, measured and familiar. Nathaniel stopped beside her without speaking immediately. Outside, the estate workers' earlier tracks had already begun to vanish beneath fresh snow. "Oversight will continue for weeks," he said quietly. "Possibly longer. Then the house will have time to adjust," she replied. He studied her profile, the steadiness in her posture. "Most individuals in your position would have sought protection," he said. "From you?" she asked softly. A faint breath escaped him, almost a restrained smile. "From anyone who offered certainty." Evelyn turned toward him fully now. "Certainty built on concealment is not protection," she said. "It is confinement." The words lingered between them, unembellished and true. Downstairs, Lord Horace remained. In the study, meeting privately with counsel. Lady Margaret had withdrawn to her wing of the manor, her influence no longer unquestioned. Structures had shifted. Authority had been recalibrated. The estate would endure, but not in silence. You changed more than a timeline, Nathaniel said after a moment. You altered the foundation. Evelyn considered that carefully. No, she answered. The foundation was already unstable. I only refused to pretend it was solid. The winter wind brushed faintly against the glass, a quiet reminder of the world beyond inherited walls and controlled narratives. Nathaniel's gaze softened, not with sentiment, but with respect. You have options now, he said. The marriage remains legally valid, but the financial incentive behind it no longer dictates its urgency. You are not bound by the same pressures. Choice again. The word returned, heavier and more tangible than before. Evelyn looked out at the snow-covered grounds stretching nearly half a mile into gathering twilight. She could leave. She could stay. She could redefine her position inside a house that no longer viewed her as a simple instrument. For now, she said slowly, I will remain. Nathaniel inclined his head once. Not approval, not persuasion, acknowledgement. The fire in the distant hearth glowed faintly, casting warmth across polished floors. The investigation would continue. Reputations would adjust. The estate would adapt to oversight instead of outrunning it. And Evelyn, no longer 19 in spirit, though only days older in fact, felt something settle within her that had not existed when she first stepped through the doors. Not fear, not obligation, autonomy. As the last light faded beyond the iron gates, Langley Manor stood quiet, but no longer concealed. Some futures are written in ink before dawn. Others are rewritten when someone dares to pause the pen. And sometimes, the quietest refusal becomes the moment a life begins to belong to itself.